One of the interesting side effects of digital synthesizers is, as we mentioned before, their ability to sample sounds. Not just sounds like elephants trumpeting in telephones, but actually off other people's records. Drum sounds, bass sounds, brass sounds. In fact, it goes on all the time. I've had cases of I've heard a record and I thought I'll steal the snare drum sound off that, it's really nice, and got it in the machine and looked at the waveform and found out it was one of mine that's been pinched from somewhere else. So it's going on all the time, and I do it quite a lot. What the publishers and people like that are going to say when they find out actually what's going on is going to be rather interesting. But to give you an example of some of the things that are done, I've got an album here by an unknown who I think's got a real future, a man named Mr. David Bowie. And about a couple of years ago, he put out an album with a track on it called Let's Dance, and the bass drum and snare drum sound on that record was rather good and has been pinched by many people, including me. So let me just play you, if I can get that thing down, a bit of Let's Dance. So, this is Let's Dance by David Bowie, which I think is familiar to some people anyway. So we rather craftily sampled the bass drum and snare drum sound off that record. In fact, I've got it loaded in the machine at the moment. Sometimes this machine decides that we're doing something that really is morally wrong and refuses to do it. However, we're trying to teach it that we live in the real world and not in some sort of utopia. So, Neil is going to reboot this machine so that I can show you. It doesn't like me stealing. So as I was saying before the machine decided to disobey, I've loaded in the sounds from this Bowie track in here, the bass and snare drum. It's quite remarkably similar. So we used that on an album by a young man called Billy Mackenzie, who trades under the name of The Associates, on a track called 13 Feelings, which if I can just find it. And it's not necessarily so that we use the sound exactly the same as we sampled it. We may tailor it to suit our own particular track. Which band is it? 2, okay. But I think it's recognisable. Right. That's the same drum sound from the record we heard before. It doesn't sound exactly the same because we've tailored it to suit our own track, but it was the character that we were after. And no doubt some crafty devil has sampled that sound and used it on his record.
I can see, I can see.
Right, what that is, that's a voice called I Can See. It's actually a voice that's been sampled. Somebody actually said that into a microphone, and it was stored inside the Fairlight. By digitising it into its memory, it actually fills up 128k of RAM. That 128k of RAM is in here. This is the CPU unit, which also houses the disk drive and the hard disk drive. When we actually sample a sound in here, so that the Fairlight can deal with it, it divides it into 128 different segments, okay? And if we go on to page D, you can actually see every fourth segment, and they're actually stacked behind each other to give you a much more visual representation of the sound. Right, I can go back to page 2 again, and we can load in some more sounds. We can load in the sound here, which is a sort of fuzz guitar sound. Or this kind of sound, which is quite a famous sound. It's called Orc 2. Okay, you don't actually have to sample a sound to be able to create sound on the Fairlight. You can actually generate your own by drawing waveforms, and that's what page 6 is all about. If we have a look at page 6, we can go to the first segment. Remember that we've got 128 of them, and we can draw a very basic waveform like this, and then fill that in. Then we can go along to segment 128, and we can draw a much more complex waveform that's going to sound very It's going to have a lot of high frequency information in it, and fill that in. And if we go to page D, you can actually see that there's segment 1, the very boring waveform, and there's segment 128. What I'm going to do now is ask the computer to fill in the gaps and merge from this to this. And we do that on page 6. Sort of interpolation, so that the sound will actually change as it's being played rather than remain static. And here's page D showing it actually happening. Right, there's also another page in the Fairlight called page R, and that's a rhythm sequencer page, and you use that to load in several different sounds and get them to play simultaneously.
I can see.
Sequencers as we know them today are digital devices. They're capable of storing entire pieces of music, just an electronic representation of a score, just as a word processing disk is an electronic representation of a document. What you can do with a word processor with words, you can do in a sequencer, a good sequencer now, with musical entities like notes.
The microprocessor has made music controllable for the first time. For the first time, musicians and composers can actually consider music out of real time, the piece of jargon that suggests that it's live. We've had recording studios and so on for the sort of best part of this century, but it's not been very malleable, not very manipulable. But now music can actually be shifted away from the moment it's created to a point where it can live in computer memory and can be manipulated to one's heart's content before it's broadcast or before it's performed.
Sometimes I hear a record and go, that drummer is magnificent. What tremendous feel and power and stuff there, and only to find out 2 weeks later I've been listening to a machine. But I haven't been listening to a machine. I've been listening to a human mind working through a machine, you know. I mean, I don't think it makes you any a better carpenter by the fact that you can bash nails in with your fist with no machine. You know, the smart guy uses a hammer. It's less painful.
This film is totally missing the point.
Most people think of synthesizers as keyboard instruments. When this advert appeared in 1981, the company concerned was deluged with inquiries from guitarists. Unfortunately, even the mighty Apple computer wouldn't support a guitar neck glued to it. The ad was a spoof to sell software.
The guitar synthesizer works like this. The pitch and dynamics of each string are detected by this hexaphonic pickup and then relayed to the floor module, where a computer recognizes the pitch and converts it to a binary code. The synthesizer also recognizes pitch bend. And in terms of sounds, it's really like any keyboard synthesizer. By using the string select function, you can assign the synthesizer sound to individual strings on the guitar, and this allows you to blend with the regular guitar sound. And by using the hold function on the synthesizer, you can sustain the sound indefinitely. And by presetting different tunings into the memory banks, you can transpose the held chord while playing on top.
I think this film's missing the point because I think there's a high concentration here on the professional and on the most expensive and the most elaborate and the most advanced equipment available. And the whole point is that all of that technology and all of that experimentation and all of that extraordinary resource is available at a lower level, albeit, to anybody in the street. They can go out and buy a synthesizer tomorrow in a small 4-track recording studio, and they can make, well, they can actually make a record in their bedroom. That's quite simple. The only difference will be quality and quantity, but that apart, the technology is exactly the same.
What cost £20,000 now will cost £1,000 inside a few years. And I think that's going to mean that such power is accessible to all. And I think that's probably the most significant change. After that, we're then going to begin to find out what we can do with the machines.
Well, you certainly have to hand it to the Japanese. Anyone who can produce a synthesizer of this quality, at the kind of price it is, has really achieved a breakthrough in synthesizers. It uses a technique known as frequency modulation synthesis, which sounds very complicated, but actually it's quite simple. It just means that you use one sound to control another sound. And the theorists at Yamaha worked out that you can produce effectively any sound using a combination of 6 source sine waves, and Yamaha give you these, what they call algorithms, which are combinations of those sources, to play with yourself. They also give you some very, very good presets. This timpani sound is one of my favorites, and there's very good organ sound. And a good bass sound. But it's not so easy to program yourself. The problem with frequency modulation synthesis is that if you change one element of the sound, everything else changes. So you need a lot of time, a lot of patience. But as a preset instrument, it's quite remarkable.
I think every one of us are creative creatures, and I feel computer technology will enable us, all of us, not just the lucky ones who happen to be in the right place at the right time, but all of us to experience the thrill of being creative.
Technological change always brings crises in society. It's not just happening in the music profession, it's happening in other areas. I mean, it's happening in administrative areas where computers and storage and retrieval of information that are being brought in. Of course, it will create crises, and the job of, as my view is that the job of the Musicians' Union is to endeavour to try to anticipate these crises as they come along and to deal with them in the best way that we possibly can.
Because the whole point about this sort of technology is that once it's begun from its very, very base root, and that was the point at which, if you like, Bob Moog's voltage-controlled oscillator moved from being that to being a digital device. The minute that happened, everything is thrown into a process of change, and there's nothing that can be done to halt or slow down that process. I don't know whether I answered your question, actually. I can't remember what it was.
That programme can be seen again next Monday at 5:30 here on 2.